Fox News alert on new fallout after President Obama all but admits to widespread government spying on millions of regular Americans in remarks about 90 minutes ago. Brand new hour here of America Live. Welcome, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. Today, President Obama said he welcomes debate over this. We'll do that now. Get you up to speed first. The National Security Agency is collecting data from calls of every American signed up for phone service with any of the three major networks, Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint, nearly the entire country. The feds also have direct access to servers operated by the world's biggest tech companies, including Facebook, Google, that would include Gmail, Yahoo, Skype, and more, though the companies deny it. They can see emails, web searches, even credit card transactions being performed by various millions of people suspected of no wrongdoing. A short time ago, the president said these invasions of privacy are worth it to protect Americans from terrorism.
The modest encroachments on privacy that are involved in getting phone numbers or duration without a name attached and not looking at content, that on net it was worth us doing. Now, some other folks may have a different assessment of that.
And here is one of those folks. Jonathan Turley is among the nation's top constitutional scholars. He is a chaired professor of constitutional law at George Washington University and the proprietor of jonathanturley.org, a great legal website that we use often, Jonathan. So we thank you for being on today with your take on it. And you've been a fierce advocate for civil liberties, and you've been a big critic of George W. Bush on this issue and of Barack Obama prior to today on this issue. So your reaction now to the president's defense of this program today?
Well, I thought it was curious. I'm not too sure what questions he was answering, because they were not the questions being posed by the civil liberties community. First of all, the notion that these programs are modest is rather laughable. I mean, what the government is creating are massive data banks that will effectively make transparent the communications and activities of citizens who are not charged with any crime. I mean, if you look at those telephone companies, they were demanding every single phone call made by every single citizen. It's the type of surveillance that once was thought futuristic, that wasn't even technically possible, but it is now. And the question that is being raised here is, how will this type of fishbowl society change not just our relationship to our government, but who we are? If you feel that all of your communications are being fed into a massive data bank that the government has access to, it's a major violation of privacy. And I'm really astonished by the dismissive attitude of the president.
The president came out today and said on two fronts, offered a defense. Number one, we're not listening to the phone calls. We're just mining the records, basically what your phone bill would show. And number two, as far as the internet searches and emails and so on, we don't do that if you're an American citizen or if you're inside the United States of America.
Yeah, Megyn, I thought that was particularly curious because the earlier surveillance program we learned about yesterday did involve communications inside the country, did involve U.S. citizens. He seemed completely unconnected from reality, which is a dangerous thing when he's heading the executive branch of the United States. The other thing is that when he says, I'm not looking at, or we're not looking at the content of emails, that's not a power that he has. It's not some striking a balance. He's not allowed to do that under the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment protects us from that type of surveillance. He needs a court order. So to list that as somehow a gesture towards citizens is a curious one because he doesn't have the power to do it.
I thought it was interesting that, yesterday we heard the reports that, okay, they're looking at our phone records. They've got our phone records. They've been doing it for 7 years. Dianne Feinstein came out and confirmed. It's been going on for years now. And there was a question about whether, well, are they actually looking at them or are they just collecting them? And then when they have reasonable suspicion that we're involved in a potential terrorist activity, then they look at them. That seemed to be where the administration was headed with its defense, even when they put out, the Director of National Intelligence put out a statement today saying, the court only allows the data to be queried when there's reasonable suspicion that the particular basis for the query is associated with a foreign terrorist organization. All right, so I thought, okay, this is what they're trying to tell us. We don't look at it unless we have reason to believe you're looking at you're talking to terrorists. But here's what the president said. He seemed to bypass that and acknowledge that the only way they go to the court again is if they want to listen in on the phone call. This is soundbite number 1 for the control room.
By sifting through this so-called metadata, they may identify potential leads with respect to folks who might engage in terrorism. If these folks, if the intelligence community then actually wants to listen to a phone call, they've got to go back to a federal judge, just like they would in a criminal investigation.
So it sounds like they're using it from the get-go.
Well, it's a curious effort to make citizens feel comfortable with having their government constantly surveil who they're emailing, who they're calling, how long, from where. It's an astonishing effort, and if it's successful, I think it's a real condemnation of who the American people have become. You know, the framers of the Constitution warned us never to base government power on the assumption of the good motivations of our officials. You can't rely on that. You can't give them that power. What they're doing here is acquiring massive power in the collection of this data. And what they're saying is, look, we just collect it and we look at it when we need to. That's hardly an assurance.
Yeah,
and by the way, that metadata,
yeah,
there's a lot of privacy stuff there.
But let me ask you about that, because you, as I said, have been an outstanding critic of this for a long time. And one of the defense, we're going to have Steve Moore from the Wall Street Journal following you up in a minute, because they wrote an editorial today defending this program. One of their points was, this isn't new. They say this has been out there since 2006. This is in the Journal. And we went back and we looked, and sure enough, USA Today, this is from May 11th, 2006, headline, NSA has massive database of Americans' phone calls. And it says the spy agency uses the data to analyze calling patterns in an effort to detect terrorist activity, and seems to unveil this very thing that we're now discussing. And then I know you went on TV and criticized it then. What is different between what we learned then and what we've learned now?
One of the biggest differences is that the government has acknowledged the existence of this program in a way it didn't do before. Just last February, the Obama administration succeeded in blocking a lawsuit of journalists and civil liberties groups to try to challenge the legality of its surveillance programs. And they classified all the evidence you needed to make that case. And then when this came out, they didn't hesitate to go ahead and give precisely that evidence to confirm, yep, we do have these data banks, we are engaging in this surveillance. And so the degree to which the government has acknowledged these programs and the additional information we have is very different. And we can have a debate right now as to what we want for this country. Is this the type of country we want to live in? Do we want to create these data banks that will allow citizens to be followed effectively in real time by their government?
Jonathan Turley, thank you very much for being here, sir.
Thank you, Megan.
All the best. And now to the other side of the debate, Steve Moore, part of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Steve, good to see you. Okay, so your thoughts in response to what Professor Turley was saying.
You know, I thought one of the most, and by the way, I have a great deal of respect for Jonathan, and I'm a civil libertarian myself, Megan, and I do think the big issue here is the balance between freedom and safety, right? That's really what we're debating here. Now, Jonathan said at the end there, what kind of a country do we want to live in? And I think that's a great way to frame this issue. And the way, look, I believe that a lot of these techniques that are being used by our counterterrorism units are actually working. And we know that they've actually foiled in the past some terrorism incidents. And so what I would suggest, Megan, is for people to think about, when we think about what kind of country we want to live in, do we want to live in a country where schools are being bombed and shopping centers are bombed and buildings like the World Trade Center? That's the kind of world we live in, and that's the kind of thing we have to keep in mind here, that this may deter those kinds of events from happening. What
do you make of the fact that, you know, as the Journal pointed out, this thing had been reported back in 2006. We look back to see what happened in the wake of that USA Today report. President Bush came out and did not acknowledge the program, but talked very much the way President Obama talked today about how anything we do has been authorized by a court, and you know, we're good on that. Trust us, we're going to protect the American people. But now we have the president come out and basically acknowledge the program after his director of national intelligence did as well.
Well, you know, Megan, I would say that this is not the kind of thing that an administration and a counterterrorism effort would want to advertise. That, look, we don't want terrorists to know that we are keeping track of this kind of information. And so the fact that it was kept secret may make sense from the perspective of keeping us safe. Look, one of the reasons I think people are very angry about this, Megan, is because of what's going on with these other scandals, right?
Right,
I mean,
the erosion of trust.
Exactly.
But let me ask you that, because we made that point earlier.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you in particular about the emails, because that is content monitoring. If they're looking at our emails, then that is content. That's the same as a wiretap. I mean, that's watching and reading your communications. It's not just looking at your records. And the president today said, well, he didn't deny that they do it. He said, well, we don't do it to the Americans. When you read the Washington Post report on it, they say, well, in determining whether you're an American who they can do it to, they only need a 51% certainty of foreignness. Is that good enough?
Well, that's a good question. And by the way, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know exactly what's permissible under the Patriot Act and what is not. But I will say this: that program makes me nervous, Megan, that the government is spying on our emails, especially American citizens who are not suspects. But this does circle around to the IRS scandal, because what we know from the IRS scandal, Megan, is that the Obama administration has been keeping enemies lists of obviously conservatives. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing this reaction from many of my good friends in the conservative movement who feel like maybe if they're targeting us for audits, are they also targeting us for spying on our phone call, on our emails, and listening in our phone conversations?
And we had testimony. We're going to get into this in about 15 minutes right here.
Yeah.
We had testimony under oath from DNI James Clapper, specifically denying that they ever did this. It was 4 months ago, Steve. They've been doing it for 7 years. I mean, talk about erosion of trust.
Well, that's a good point, and he may actually be, I don't know, again, I'm not a lawyer, but he may have a perjury problem there, given that we know that it was happening, and he wasn't denying it. But look, what I want people to really think about here is whether you believe if these kinds of counterterrorism efforts are keeping us safe and preventing 500 or 1,000 people from being killed, is it worth it? And I think that's the point we were trying to make in our editorial today.
Yeah, and now the president wants to have that debate, and of course, this is another program that's been outed, and we heard a lot of rhetoric from the administration today talking about how bad this leak was. There's a question about whether they're going to go after the leaker as well. Steve, what a situation. Thank you so much for being out with your perspective.
Thank you, Megan.